Introduction to the Old Testament, Unit 8, Exodus to Deuteronomy. Now we will be dealing with this in two different units. We're going to look first at the historical material, and then we will deal with that which is religious. Now the key names and terms that we have for Exodus is the supremacy of Yahweh over pagan deities, the Exodus as a redemptive element for ancient Israel, the Mosaic Law as a religious and social charter for Israel, and then the presence of God symbolized in the tabernacle. Now those last two, on the Mosaic Law and the presence of God in the tabernacle, we'll deal mainly with in the next unit. In the book of Exodus, we have some major themes: Yahweh, the 10 plagues, the Passover, the 10 commandments, and the presence of God. And again, the Passover, the 10 commandments, and the presence of God will also be dealt with in the next unit. Now, the purpose of the book of Exodus is to explain how the Israelites became slaves in Egypt and their deliverance from Egyptian bondage. The book also reveals the God whose name is Yahweh, and relates how his divine presence came to dwell among the people, Israel. In the first chapter of Exodus, we read that the people are in Egypt. Now, we saw in the end of the book of Genesis that Jacob and his family moved to Egypt. Now, they, according to what God said to Abraham, they would be slaves or oppressed in Egypt for 400 years. Now we're coming to the end of that time, and so it's where God listens to the people and redeems them from Egypt. We read about the oppression in chapter 1 and how the Israelites had become too numerous. And the Egyptians are afraid that if any enemy power attacked them, the Israelites would join with them and escape from Egypt. So they have made them slaves. And we are told that, first of all, they want to reduce the number of Israelites. And the first attempt is for the midwives to kill all of the male children. The midwives don't want to do this, and when they report to Pharaoh, they say, well, the Egyptian women aren't like the Hebrew women. The Hebrew women give birth before they get there. And if you look at the portrait of Egyptian women in Egyptian art, you see that they're usually portrayed as very thin. The Hebrew women are portrayed as quite stocky. And this may be true, that the Egyptian women are not as likely to give birth as quickly as the Hebrew women. Well, when that didn't work, the command is given that all of the male children are supposed to be thrown into the river. We then have the birth of Moses, chapter 2. Moses is seen as an unusual child. Now, often I joke about this as saying that what woman would not consider her child as to be superior? But in this case, there is an emphasis upon the fact that Moses is an unusual baby, and his mother hides him for 3 months. But then when she cannot conceal him any longer, she obeys the king's order and puts him in the river. But she does so by constructing a basket, waterproofs it, puts the child in the basket, and puts the basket then in the Nile River. The basket is found by the daughter of Pharaoh. She takes the baby and adopts him as her own. Moses' sister, who is older than he is waiting there until she can offer the services of Moses' mother to nurse the child. And so Moses is given to his mother, and she is paid for actually nursing the child. And then when the child is weaned, then he is taken into the palace and is raised with the other Egyptian children. But then it very quickly passes over the lifetime of Moses until he is an adult. In chapter 2, verse 11, it tells us that when Moses had grown up, that he went to his own people and watched them. And there was an Egyptian that was beating a Hebrew man. And so Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, two Israelites were fighting, and Moses intervenes, and the one who is the instigator of the problem says, "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Well, then Moses realizes that it is known, and so he flees from Egypt and goes to Midian. That is where we find Moses then. Chapter 2 of Exodus says that now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up, came to their rescue, and watered their flock. So when the girls explained why they had gotten home so early, that an Egyptian man helped them, then their father, Reuel, wants to invite him home. Moses is given Zipporah, one of the daughters, as a wife, and Moses becomes a shepherd for the family of Reuel. In chapter 3 is the story of the burning bush. This is where Moses is shepherding his flock, and he sees a bush burning, but it isn't consumed. And this is strange. So he goes over and examines what is happening. Here, an angel speaks to him, or we could say God speaks to him. It really doesn't matter which you say, but God tells him that he is going to send Moses back to Egypt to lead the people out. There is quite a conversation that goes on. Moses is reluctant to do any of this because he doesn't speak well. And finally, God tells him, "You're going anyway, and Aaron is going to be your spokesman." So Aaron meets him in the desert, and the two of them return to Egypt. Now they are told to go to Pharaoh and say that God wants his people to go into the wilderness and worship him. This is going to take a 3-day journey. It'll take a day for them to go out, a day for the worship, and a day to return. But Pharaoh is reluctant to allow the people to go. So there is a literary pattern that is followed as Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. The first time they go to Pharaoh and he is in his palace. The second time he is by the water, the Nile River. And the third time it isn't definite just where he is. But this pattern is followed. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. and it is definitely a literary format that is followed. When Pharaoh refuses to let the people go, he has promised that plagues will take place. And we have a number of these. The first is the turning of the water in the Nile to blood. But the Egyptian magicians also are able to do this. Oh, I should have mentioned first, when Aaron and Moses went to Pharaoh, they threw the rod down that Moses had, and it turned into a serpent. Well, the Egyptian magicians also did this, but Moses' rod, which was a serpent now, ate up all of the snakes that they had thrown down. Now, the first plague is the turning of water to blood. They can't find water anywhere. They have to dig it down to get drinking water. And it ends when Moses informs God that it is time to remove that plague. God controls the timing of all of these. And often Moses will ask Pharaoh, when is it that you want this plague to be removed? Well, the second is frogs. Now, if you have water in the Nile that has turned to blood, the frogs are going to come up out of the Nile. So these two may be connected, and there are frogs everywhere. And again, they are removed when Pharaoh says that he wants them removed. And then there are gnats, or what it really is here is biting midges, Colicotis canthothorake. This is a technical term for a particular type of insect, and this insect is going to be connected with the fifth plague of the death of the cattle. Well, the midges are taken care of, and then it says there are flies. This fly is the stable fly, and it is Stomoxys cassellans. There is a book where the plagues are discussed, and these are identified. And this plague is connected with number 6, the boils. So the first 6 plagues are all connected. The blood in the Nile, the frogs coming up, the midges, and then the stable flies. And then as a result of the midges, there is the death of the cattle. This is the African horse sickness and blue tongue. And many of the animals of the Egyptians are killed. And about this time, God makes a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. Where the Israelites live, nothing happens to their animals. Then we have boils that break out on the people. And this is a result of the flies in the 4th plague. Then there are hail and lightning that comes, and the people are warned in advance. So if they bring their workers into shelter, they are not harmed. But if they are left in the field, then the hail kills them. The 7th plague has to do with locusts. And this is a severe locust plague. Locusts usually come from southern Africa, and then they move north, and this is what they did in the case of Egypt in the 8th plague of locusts. And then there is darkness, the 9th plague, and that darkness is probably a dust storm. The author of this book that I mentioned goes through a dust storm in Egypt, and it lasts for 2 or 3 days, and you can't see anything because of the dust. And the main plague is the 10th one. This is the death of the firstborn son of men and animals in Egypt. And we need to take a look at this. This is in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Also chapter 12. In chapter 11, now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. Now, along with this 10th plague, which is the death of the firstborn, goes the Passover event. The Israelites are told that they are to pick a lamb, have it ready for sacrifice on a particular day, and they are then to sacrifice that lamb, take the blood from the lamb, and put it on the lintels and the doorposts of each house. Wherever there was a blood on the doorposts, the people inside were safe. They ate the lamb and bitter herbs and unleavened bread that night, and anything that was left over was destroyed. The next day, they left Egypt, and that is what we normally call the Exodus. This is in chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. And that is when they are instructed to carry out the Passover event. When the blood is seen on the doorposts, the angel passes over that house and no one is hurt. So that is the Passover event. Now, the actual Exodus will begin in chapter 13. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal. So what God had killed in Egypt now becomes dedicated to God among the Israelites. And then it says in chapter 13, verse 5, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land he swore to your forefathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony in this month. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, and on the seventh day hold a festival to the Lord. Eat unleavened bread during those 7 days. And so that is what is observed every year after that. There is no blood put on the doorposts after that initial time. But it is celebrated every year and is called the Passover. When the Israelites get into the wilderness, they run into many problems. God doesn't take them the shortest route, which is along the Mediterranean coast, because there are a number of Egyptian forts there, and the people would be hampered by the soldiers, the Egyptian soldiers. So God leads them in a different way. It is difficult to know exactly what route is involved in the Exodus. There are several different routes, a northern, a middle, and a southern route, and we're not sure exactly which route was taken. But we are told that the Israelites seemed to be lost in the wilderness. And Pharaoh is told this, and he's going to go after them. In chapter 14, verse 13, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." And this is when the Israelites crossed over what we would call the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. And again, we're not sure exactly where that is. It would be nice if we knew all of these places, but they just aren't that accurate in the description. Moses stretched out his rod again, and the Lord dried up the sea. There was a pillar that was traveling in front of Israel's army, and it now withdrew and went between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea in verse 21, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The Israelites went across on dry land, and it says the water was piled up on either side. And the Egyptians then went into the sea to pursue the Israelites, and they were engulfed then in the waters, and they were destroyed. I should mention the Song of Moses, and we will discuss this in more detail in the next unit, but that is one that tells about how God preserved the Israelites and overthrew the Egyptians. Then in chapter 15, verse 22, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah, because Marah means bitter. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" And then Moses cried out to the Lord. The Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water. The water became sweet. And then it says the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. He said, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." And then it says they came to Elim, and there were 12 springs there and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. Then the people complain about not having food, and so God provides food for them. This is like a coriander seed, and it falls during the night along with dew, and in the morning the people see it, and they go out and pick this up from the ground. They are to pick up enough for everybody in their family. And the comment is made that those who picked up a lot didn't have too much, and those who picked up a little had enough. So this is a miracle in itself. And they also complain about not having meat. And so God provides quail for them. Quail come in, and they have enough to last them for several days. In fact, some of them get sick on this, and there are many who die as a result of the eating of the quail. In chapter 17, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people needed water, and so Moses is told to go to a certain rock, take his staff with him. And God says in verse 6 of chapter 17, "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So this is what Moses did, and he called the place Massa and Meribah, because that is where they quarreled and they tested the Lord. Chapter 17 also tells us about the Amalekites. They are enemies of Israel, and they attacked Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some men and fight against the Amalekites." So the next day the battle took place. Moses was on the top of a hill, and when he held up his hands, the Lord gave victory to the Israelites. If he had dropped his hands, then the Amalekites prevailed. So Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side and one on the other, and Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. In chapter 18, Jethro, who is Moses' father-in-law, he's also called Ruel, that he came with Moses' wife and his two sons, and he met them there, and Moses told him about all that had happened to them up to that time. Now we will skip over from there to the book of Numbers. We want to deal with the historical material, and we will deal with the counting of the people. In Numbers 1 through chapter 4, there is a numbering of the people. Each of the tribes is counted, and then the total is given for each tribe. Then a final total is given. This is in chapter 1 and verse 46. The total number was 603,550. Now they didn't count the Levites because they are special, and they are going to be counted separately. Then we are told how the tribes are to line up, how they will camp each day. We are told that on the east, towards the sunrise, you have Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. And then on the south side, you have Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. And then you have the tent of meeting, which is in the middle. And then on the west are Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And on the north are the divisions of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. So you have them definitely arranged in reference to the Levites. There is a second census that takes place at the end of the book of Numbers in chapter 26, and there is almost the same number of people. We have the 12 tribes mentioned and the descendants of each, and the total number of the men of Israel was 601,730. So there are slightly fewer people, not quite 2,000, but about that number. All of the people who were 20 years or older died in the wilderness that were counted in the first census, and they were not around when the second census was taken in chapter 26. Now there are many rebellions that took place, and these are enumerated for us in the book of Numbers. We have in chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. And then you have fire burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. And then when they cried out to the Lord, and he ceased the fire. The place was called Taberah, and that means a burning. And then in chapter 11, verse 11, he asks the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you, that you put the burden of all these people on me?" This is when the people are complaining about Moses' leadership. And God says, they're your people. You should take care of them. And sometimes you have God saying to Moses, you brought them out. And so there's this little sort of a contest between God and Moses as we go along. Because of their cravings, many of them are killed. You find that in verse 34. The place was named Kibrot Hatava because there they buried the people who had craved other food. From Kibrot Hatava, the people traveled to Hazarot and stayed there. So they're on their way. But in chapter 12, Moses is not only fighting against the people, he's fighting against his own family. Miriam and Aaron think they should have more say in what happens. And so God calls all three of them out to the tent, and he meets with them, and he says in chapter 12, verse 6, "When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions. I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles." Now, as he sees the form of the Lord, "Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" Then Miriam has leprosy. Aaron sees this and asks Moses to pray for her. So Moses prays to God. She's cured of the leprosy, but because she has been stricken, she's required to stay outside the camp for 7 days. And then we have the 12 spies in chapter 13 and 14, and most of you are familiar with this. There are 12 spies, one from each of the tribes, and they are sent to reconnoiter the land to see what it's like, how many people are there, how about the cities. And it takes them 40 days to go through the land and gain this information. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land, verse 25. And they gave a very good report of the land. But then the people said, "We aren't able to defeat those people. They're too big, their cities are too strong." But there are two, Joshua and Caleb, who try to convince the people they are able to do it. So they are the only ones who do not die in that 40-year period. For each of the days that the spies have been in the land looking at it, they are to spend 1 year in the wilderness, not being able to go into the land. We also have in chapter 16 another problem. Korah, son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, became insolent, rose up against Moses. With them were 250 Israelite men. Now the way that Moses deals with this, in verse 16, Moses said to Korah, "You and all your followers are to appear before the Lord tomorrow, you and they and Aaron. Each man is to take his censer and put incense in it, 250 censers in all." So they did that. In chapter 16, verse 23, the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." So Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him, and he warned them, "Get away from them." So it says they moved away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children, and little ones at the entrance to their tents. Then the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them with everything that belonged to them, and they went down alive into the grave. And then fire came from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who had the censers. All of these censers were then gathered up. They were beaten into sheets that were used in the altar of burnt offering. Then in chapter 20, we have a sin that is committed by Aaron and Moses. This is another case where they are supposed to bring water from the rock, but it isn't quite the same as the previous one. Before, Moses was told to take the rod and strike the rock. But here, there was no water. In verse 9, chapter 20, Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But both Moses and Aaron are condemned for this. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." So neither Aaron or Moses is allowed to go into the land. Chapter 21, we have the Canaanite king of Arad heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atharim. He attacked the Israelites and captured some of them. And then Israel made this vow to the Lord, "If you will deliver these people into our hands, we will totally destroy their cities." So the Lord listened to them, and they destroyed the towns, and the place was named Hormah, which means destruction. Then in chapter 21, they move on towards the place where they're going to cross over the Jordan River. This is towards Moab. And in chapter 21, verse 21, Israelites sent messengers to say to Sihon, king of the Amorites, "Let us pass through your country. We will not turn aside into any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway until we have passed through your territory." But Sihon would not listen to them. So they came out to attack the people of Israel, and Israel defeated them, and Israel settled in the land of the Amorites. And then there is another problem that they face, and that is Balaam, a prophet who is summoned by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse the Israelites. He is reluctant to come because God tells him not to go the first time, And then they send another group of messengers, more and higher in rank than the first ones. And this time he goes with them. But on the way, he has trouble with his donkey. The donkey turns aside 3 different times, crushes his foot in one case, lies down underneath him in another case. And so Balaam beats his donkey, and then the Lord opens the eyes of Balaam, and he sees the angel with a sword in his hand. And if the donkey had not turned aside 3 times, the angel would have killed Balaam. Then we have Balaam moving on, and in chapter 23, each time he builds an altar and sacrifices animals. There are 7 altars, and on each altar I've offered a bull and a ram. He does this before each of his prophecies. God gives him the message that he is to proclaim, but instead of cursing the people, he blesses them. And the first one is in chapter 23, verse 7. Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, he said, curse Jacob for me. Come, denounce Israel. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? He ends up by saying, let me die the death of the righteous, and may my end be like theirs. So he actually identifies with the Israelites. Balak takes him to another spot where he can see part of the people of Israel. The same thing happens, 7 altars, 7 rams, and 7 bulls. And he again pronounces a blessing. And then there is a third oracle in chapter 24. Again, he has the 7 altars and the 7 bulls and 7 rams. And in this case, in chapter 24, verse 1, it says, now when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not resort to sorcery as at other times, but turned his face toward the desert. And then he gives a prophecy that blesses Israel once again, and ends it by saying, may those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed. Now it's interesting the way that he begins the third oracle and the fourth one. The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of one whose eyes see clearly, the oracle of one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty, who falls prostrate and whose eyes are opened. So he says that the oracle actually comes from God. Then there is another one, his final oracle. This is in verse 20 of chapter 24. Balaam saw Amalek and uttered his oracle. Amalek was first among the nations, but he will come to ruin at last. Then he saw the Kenites and uttered his oracle. Your dwelling place is secure. Your nest is set in a rock. Yet you Kenites will be destroyed when Ashur takes you captive. Then he uttered his oracle. Ah, who can live when God does this? Ships will come from the shores of Kittim. They will subdue Ashur and Eber, and they too will come to ruin. So Balak has achieved nothing, and so he sends Balaam away. Now we also have the Midianites in chapter 31, and they are a problem. The Midianites are supposed to be wiped out. And the Lord said to Moses, take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people. So an army is sent to deal with the Midianites. In verse 7, they fought against Midian, as the Lord commanded Moses, and killed every man. Among their victims were Evi, Merechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with a sword. And then the people brought back the women and the animals, which they were not supposed to do. Moses says in verse 15 of chapter 31, "Have you allowed all the women to live?" They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. So that was not supposed to take place, but that is allowed to the soldiers. And then they are supposed to cleanse themselves, every one of them who has killed someone, touched a dead body. They are to be clean, they're to wash their clothes, and then they may come into the camp. Now, one other item that I want to deal with, and this is in chapter 27, where we have the daughters of Zelophehad. There are 5 daughters, and they want inheritance. If there are no sons, then there seems to be no inheritance. And so these daughters came to Moses. This is in chapter 27. Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord said to him, "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives, and turn their father's inheritance over to them." So this is established, the daughters will inherit. But there is a restriction that is put on them, and that comes in chapter 36 of Numbers. What if the women receive an inheritance and then marry someone from another tribe? Well, the property then goes to the other tribe, so they have to prevent this. And so we are told in verse 5 of chapter 36, "Then at the Lord's command, Moses gave this order to the Israelites. What the tribe of the descendants of Joseph is saying is right. This is what the Lord commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone that pleases, as long as they marry within the tribal clan of their father." So this is established, and then that takes care of the inheritance. Now let's move on to Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, we have a different situation. They are on the plains of Moab, and they are waiting to go in, and Moses has been talking to them throughout the whole book. The creed of Israel is found in Deuteronomy in chapter 6, verse 4 through 9. And this is the famous one that is used so many times. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This was uttered many, many times during the Holocaust, when the Jews had no hope at all. This is what they repeated as they were facing death from the Nazis. And this is the creedal statement of Israel. Then in chapter 18, I want to mention another very famous passage. This has to do with a prophet. Moses was a prophet. There was no prophet like him in the Old Testament. But in chapter 18, in verse 17, he says, "The Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. If anyone does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. Now this is a prediction of the ministry of Jesus. Jesus is the fulfillment of that prophet. And then also in Deuteronomy are the curses and the blessings. In chapter 27, we have the altar on Mount Ebal, and in verse 15, there are the curses. Cursed is the man who carves an image or casts an idol, a thing detestable to the Lord, the work of the craftsman's hands, and sets it up in secret. And cursed is the man who dishonors his father. Cursed is, so there are a number of curses there. And then in chapter 28, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, the crops of your land and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. That's about all that they need. That takes care of all of their needs. And then in chapter 31, Moses is replaced by Joshua. In chapter 31, verses 7 and 8, Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the presence of all Israel, "Be strong and courageous, for you must go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their forefathers to give them, and you must divide it among them as their inheritance. The Lord himself goes before you. He will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." And then finally in chapter 34, we have the death of Moses. In the first verse it says that Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah across from Jericho. The Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. Now, on a clear day, it is possible to see all of the land from that vantage point. The problem is there are only a few days in the year when it is clear enough. And then it says in verse 5 of chapter 34, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. And that is fortunate, because wherever there is a prominent person buried, it becomes a place of worship. So it would have been turned into something that should not have been used. God buried Moses, and nobody knows the place where he buried him. Now, for the date of the Exodus, there is the book by Walton, The Chronological and Background Charts of the Old Testament, pages 102 and 103. That is a very useful book, and I would advise all of you to purchase it.